The use of Marxism and um, conflict theory later on has been uh, really been going on a long time. You can date some of the earlier implications and uses of it in reference to deviance back to Bonger in 1916, criminality and economic conditions. Bonger's arguing that capitalism creates business owners who are encouraged to dominate and take advantage of others in society to make a profit. Um, this ultimately leads to dehumanization of the worker, which in turn creates deviance. Some more contemporary uses, Stephen Spitzer in 1975, 1983, The Marxian Theory of Deviance, talking about how capitalism is changing to advanced forms of capitalism, i.e. monopoly capitalism, and the change increases the likelihood of the creation of problem populations. We know that monopoly capitalism essentially is looking at capitalism as it advances and argues that it would become more efficient and, of course, increase educational levels. This creates some new conflict categories, social junk and social dynamite, in reference to the problem populations. Social junk is the unneeded laborers, the unneeded, uneducated laborers that have been replaced by uh, the industrial process, whether it's mechanization or efficiency. Efficiency just has removed those laborers, the need for that labor from the workforce. They're a problem. And then the social dynamite is those that are critical of the system, the educated individuals. So as capitalism becomes more efficient, becomes more advanced, it needs educated workers. And the more educated they get, the more those workers ask about inequality and start seeing the problems inherent in the system. According to Spitzer and Marxian theories, these problem populations have to be controlled, and they're controlled through criminalization. Laws are created focusing on their status and behaviors. When problem populations get too big, too organized, or no longer respond to informal social controls, then you need to construct them as criminal populations. We saw this in the late 1990s and the early 2000s with the development of maybe what many would consider the first actual movement where the workers of the world were uniting. We saw pushback against the World Trade Organizations in the Battle for Seattle in 1999, and then civil protesters were following the institutions of advanced capitalism around the planet whenever they did meetings and they were protesting and they were shutting down these protests. And then shortly after 9/11 and the passage of the Patriot Act in the United States, these groups began to be labeled as deviant. These groups began to be labeled as terrorists. And once they were labeled as terrorists, then a new set of rules that were placed in the Patriot Act could be used against them. And ultimately those rules and these new constructions of civil disobedience being constructed as acts and forms of terrorism ultimately uh, uh, pushed back and quelled many of these rebellious folks that were actually coming out and struggling against the bourgeoisie. Another important theory and theorist, of course, is Gus Field, And Gusfield's conflict theories are arguing more that conflict is not just the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There's other forms of conflict that have to be taken into consideration. Gusfield discusses the use of law to control behaviors. He argues that laws have two functions, instrumental and symbolic. The instrumental function tells individuals what actions they can and cannot engage in, and then sends out agents of the law to enforce those rules. Thou shalt not drive above the speed limit. If you do drive above the speed limit and you're out on the highways or you're in your local areas, you might run across an agent of the law that ultimately pulls you over and either issues you a ticket and or arrest you. And then there's the symbolic function of law, which is inviting consideration of what society thinks. Law supports the cultural beliefs of one group over another. Jim Crow laws in the South in the late 1880s, early 1900s, up through the Civil Rights Movement, they benefited and supported the cultural beliefs of the time. And what we know from Jim Crow is that one group exerted their power and influence over another group to the detriment of freed slaves and ultimately what we refer to as African Americans in the United States. George Vold is another important theorist that's bringing deviance and Marxism into criminology. Vold's arguing that there's a process individuals undertake to become a part of a particular group, and then they develop relationships within and among groups after that takes shape. And make no mistake, folks, we are group people. Humans want to form into groups. We are not comfortable being by ourselves all the time. This leads us to some ideas about the creation and maintenance of the group, how that works over time. We know that, according to Vold, more similarity between the interests and loyalties is going to lead to a stronger group. And Vold is also arguing that society is a constant interaction of these groups. And sometimes their interests overlap, sometimes their interests come in conflict with each other. The goal of all groups with similar interests is maintained and ultimately would flourish, while some others ultimately are going to be disbanded. Conflict rises when groups are threatened by competing interests, and individuals fight for interests of the group. And as they have to struggle for whatever it is that they're struggling for, let's say civil rights, then the more, take for example, those engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, whether they were sitting outside of a Woolworth or they were riding a Greyhound bus down into the Deep South, the more violence they ran into, the stronger the loyalty within the group became. Vold also had some ideas on the use of law and how it maintains interests, especially interests of the ruling elite. For Vold, law is how groups maintain interest and protect themselves. Ultimately, negotiation takes place between two competing groups when it's possible, and in the end, law is a tool for more powerful groups to maintain interests and services that benefit them. If there is an us against them in reference to these theorists, The us is those that are advantaged, and the them are those that are disadvantaged. Marx talked about it as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You could say the elite and the mass, rich versus poor. So you see how it breaks out in reference to power. Turk's another important theorist, doing work in 1969 and, of course, 1976. Talks about the use of law as a social control agent. For Turk, law is a resource that groups struggle to control. The control over law provides power to criminals, or it provides power to criminalize or make deviant those that are less powerful. And it represents cultural values that are enforced on the less powerful. So once again, this is all about power. Those with the power to socially construct reality, and those without the power to control a social construction that's happening to them. Turk talks about 5 types of resource control. The first is control the means of direct physical violence, i.e. war and police power. This is a function of the state. The state is the only entity in society that has the legitimate use of power. And they want to control, or the second type of resource is control of production or economic power. This is more your traditional Marxian perspective, controlling the means of production. The third is control of decision-making or political power. Fourth, the control of definitions of and access to knowledge, belief, and values. This is ideological power. And then, of course, the control of human attention and living time, which is diversionary power. All of these things used together are tools for which the groups in power are using to disempower the disadvantaged groups in society. Another important theorist is Quinney, doing his work in 1970 on the social reality of crime. He offers an explanation for the social construction of crime. His work is similar to Marx's dialectical materialism, although he really doesn't make reference to Marx's dialectical materialism. Talking about social construction, once again, the process of construction, and how social relationships or an understanding of the world is ultimately a process, and understanding changes as the process evolves. And ultimately, conflict and struggle is inevitable. Quinney offered 6 propositions that essentially lead to the following conclusion. If you want to know what the 6 propositions are, go to pages 15 through 23. 15 through 23, that doesn't sound right. Sorry, if you want to know more about that, look in the book. But the social reality of crime is constructed by formulation and application of criminal definitions, the development of behavior patterns related to criminal definitions, and the construction of criminal conceptions, all of which is being carried out by those that possess the power.